My name is Juliet Vaughn, and I walked into my sister's wedding alone, completely alone. Not because I didn't have someone to bring, but because I chose to remember how it felt to stand tall without needing anyone to shield me. The ballroom was grand, deliberately so, like every detail had been plucked from a magazine spread and laid out for approval. As I stepped through the arched doorway, heels muted on the plush carpet, I felt its eyes grazing over me, pausing just long enough to register a lack. The absence of a ring, a companion, an apology. I caught whispers from the corner where the bride's new in-laws had gathered like a perfectly arranged bouquet of judgment. One woman in a silk wrap dress leaned close to another, her perfume sharp even from across the room, and whispered, "Poor thing, still can't find anyone." She said it not with concern, but with that particular breed of pity reserved for women over 30 who refused to hide. My sister Vanessa didn't even glance at me. She was radiant, smiling, radiant again, draped on the arm of a man whose tuxedo probably cost more than my monthly rent, and surrounded by people who smiled too wide, the kind of smiles you wear for cameras, not for comfort. I knew I wasn't part of this picture. I was the shadow in the frame, the one they hoped would blur quietly into the backdrop. I should have left. I almost did. But then something inside me, the stubborn thing I've had since childhood, told me to stay, to see, to bear witness to the spectacle without flinching. And then it happened. From the center table, a man stood. His hair was silver, his suit midnight blue and sharp, and though he wasn't tall, he carried the kind of authority that makes even chandeliers pause. I knew who he was, Edward Sinclair, the groom's uncle, a man whose name moved markets and whose signature had been printed on more contracts than most CEOs' business cards. He looked straight at me, and then, slowly, deliberately, he bowed. A full, courtly, unmistakable bow. And just like that, every murmur stopped. I didn't move. Couldn't. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I knew something had shifted. Growing up in the Vaughn household was like living backstage to a play you weren't cast in. Vanessa, with her golden hair and sky-blue eyes, was the lead. The adored, the paraded, the praised. I was the side note, the one who read too much, asked too many questions, took apart electronics not because they were broken, but because I wanted to know why they worked. At 10, I rebuilt the microwave. At 14, I built a self-timing oven for a school project and was scolded for not wearing a dress to the science fair. My parents didn't discourage me, not exactly. They just didn't know where to put me. "You'll grow out of that tech stuff," my mom once said, just before grounding me for skipping the homecoming dance to attend a regional robotics meet. Vanessa was rewarded for being dazzling. I was tolerated for being inconvenient. She married young, quickly, then again and again. By the third wedding, this one to Logan, a man with the kind of pedigree that opened country club gates and invited applause, the family had stopped pretending they were surprised by anything she did. They were, however, deeply invested in this marriage. Logan came with a legacy, and Vanessa, in their eyes, had finally secured something. They printed new family photos, hosted garden parties. My name was mentioned like a footnote, obligatory, brushed over. I was invited to the wedding, but the subtext was clear. Be quiet, don't draw attention, don't outshine. I wasn't planning to. I booked a flight, RSVP'd for one, and cleared my schedule. I didn't have the time, but I made it. Not for them, for me. The morning of the wedding, my mother called to remind me not to wear anything too loud. "You're not giving a keynote, Juliet," she said, laughing. "This is family. Blend in." I smiled into the silence and said I'd try. Of course, I didn't blend in. I wore black, no sparkles, clean lines, hair in a knot, minimal jewelry. I looked like myself. And, in a room engineered to reflect Vanessa's curated perfection, looking like myself was a threat. As I stepped into the reception, the air was heavy with the scent of roses and ambition. The seating chart placed me far in the back, flanked by distant cousins who sipped martinis and whispered in that performative tone women reserve for other women they don't understand. "I figured you'd have someone by now," one said, stirring her drink slowly. "A woman like you. So accomplished." It wasn't a compliment. Not really. Vanessa was at the front with Logan's family, dazzling again, swarmed by in-laws who cooed and flattered like pigeons with pearls. His mother, Gloria, had the kind of face you knew had been lifted by the best hands in Beverly Hills. Her smile was elegant, and it didn't reach her eyes. She glanced my way several times, then leaned to her sister-in-law and said something about me being the one who's always working. They laughed. I excused myself. At the bar, I ordered ginger ale and thought about leaving again. But then Vanessa approached. Her smile was tight, manicured. "Just wanted to check in," she said. "You seem distant." I blinked. "Vanessa, we haven't had a real conversation in 5 years." She laughed, that soft, self-deflecting giggle she'd used since we were kids. "Well, you're here now. That counts." She didn't ask what I'd been up to, where I'd been, or who I'd become. And before I could decide whether I wanted her to, she was gone. I returned to my seat, and that's when I heard them. Logan's uncle and cousin, seated close enough to be heard but far enough to pretend they weren't talking about me. "Pretty but cold," one said. "Probably married to her career." They chuckled, and in that moment I considered leaving again. But then Edward Sinclair stood. He moved with intention, past the main table, past Logan, past Vanessa, and then he bowed. The room inhaled. Time shifted. When he straightened, he walked to me. "Miss Vaughn," he said, voice low but certain. "It's a privilege to finally meet you. Your keynote in Zurich changed how we handle tech transitions across 3 subsidiaries. I owe you thanks." And just like that, every assumption they had made collapsed under the weight of someone who saw me not through bloodline or gossip, but through impact. I smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair. It's mutual." And with that, the room was silent. Not out of disdain, but out of awe. For the first time in my life, not a single person was asking me to be less. I didn't expect Edward Sinclair to linger, but he did. He asked if I would join him for a brief walk just outside, away from the eyes still recovering from the shift in power they had just witnessed. I said yes, not because I needed the attention, but because I wanted to see what kind of man saw me clearly in a room built to ignore me. We stepped onto the stone terrace, where the lights from inside flickered against the glass like nervous laughter trying to find its place. The air was cool, the kind of cold that wakes up your skin, not your soul. He didn't speak right away, just stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out over the manicured lawn. Then, finally, without drama, he said, "3 years ago, your firm released the integration model for decentralized AI data recovery. We were about to invest nearly $200 million into a competing platform until I saw your Zurich keynote. You changed our entire direction." I blinked. That wasn't public knowledge. "How did you know it was me?" I asked. He turned, gave me a small smile, the kind that carries weight without arrogance. "Because I pay attention to people who move the world while the world's too busy looking elsewhere." For a moment, I forgot where I was, forgot the whispers, the wine glasses clinking, the carefully curated flowers inside. "I assumed Logan didn't know," I said. "Logan doesn't know how to sync a calendar without help," Edward replied. "He's decent enough, but you built something. That matters." And it hit me, standing there in borrowed light beside a man the room revered. I had been starving for recognition in all the wrong places. I had wasted years trying to explain myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth listening to. My mother, who once told me I worked too hard, that I was too serious, that I'd scare men away. My father, who forwarded me job listings at corporations I had quietly outgrown. Vanessa, who always saw me as a foil to her sparkle, a shadow designed to throw her glow into sharper relief. None of them had ever asked me what I wanted, what I built, what I sacrificed. Edward did. When we returned to the ballroom, the air had changed. People shifted in their chairs when they saw us enter together. Gloria's lips thinned into a line of worry. Logan's eyes darted. Vanessa's hand trembled as she picked up her champagne glass. I took my seat again and smiled at the two cousins who had judged me earlier. They nodded, stiff and awkward, suddenly unsure of their footing. I had said nothing, but everything had shifted. The speeches began shortly after. Toasts about love, family, perseverance. Logan's father raised a glass and glanced at me, his voice light and careless. And of course, a cheers to family, even those who spend more time in boardrooms than ballrooms. Laughter, polite, safe. But Edward didn't laugh. He stood again. "I'd like to add something," he said. The room stilled. There are those in this room who inherited power, some who married into it. And then there's Juliet Vaughn. He gestured toward me. A woman who created value where there was none, who earns respect in rooms most of us will never enter. If we're raising glasses, mine is to her. And just like that, silence reigned again. But this time, it wasn't uncertain. It was reverent. I didn't smile, didn't flinch. I kept my eyes steady on the table in front of me. There's something more powerful than being applauded, it's being understood. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, truly seen. Not for what I could give or how well I could perform family, but for what I had built when no one was watching. My family didn't know how to react. Vanessa looked stunned. My father blinked as if trying to recall something he'd once read about me. My mother smiled faintly, a fragile thing that collapsed when I didn't return it. I didn't owe them that anymore. Later, after the music resumed and the toast faded, my mother approached. Her heels clicked softly on the marble, like she didn't want to be heard. "You look beautiful tonight," she said. I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated. "We didn't know about Zurich, or the Sinclair connection." I looked her in the eye. "You didn't ask." She reached for my hand and gave it a squeeze, a soft apology, silent and incomplete. I let her hold it for a second. Then I let go. Vanessa found me near the exit. Her voice was sharp but uncertain. "I didn't know he knew you. You never asked," I said. She looked down, then back at me. "You always made me feel like I wasn't enough." I stared at her for a moment, then replied, "And you always made me feel like I was too much." She didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. I walked out alone. The night air wrapped around me like truth, cold, unflinching, real. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I had to shrink to belong. I belonged to myself. And that was finally enough. The next morning felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. I made coffee the way I always did, black, strong, no sugar, and stood by the window of my apartment watching the city hum to life. It was quiet, but not silent. The kind of quiet that holds breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. My phone buzzed. Not a text or a call. A calendar alert. Monday, 10 a.m. Sinclair. Partner strategy session. The invitation had come in just after midnight, sent from Edward's assistant with a brief note. "Mr. Sinclair looks forward to your insight." No pitch deck, no summary, just trust. I closed the alert without responding. Not out of arrogance. I just needed a moment to hold the gravity of it. For so long, I'd been making noise in rooms where no one was listening. Now, someone had listened and offered a seat at the table. Not as a guest, as a builder. That same morning, I received another message, this one unexpected. Vanessa. Just 3 words. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen. Couldn't decide whether it was an olive branch or a tripwire. I replied with the time and place, a quiet cafe halfway between her world and mine, neutral ground where truth might have room to breathe. She arrived 15 minutes late, her makeup perfect, her smile too practiced to be honest. I wore no makeup, a black sweater, and boots I'd had for years. No armor, no polish, just me. She sat across from me, placed her phone face down, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, finally, "I didn't know you were this big." I tilted my head slightly. "Big?" She laughed nervously. "Important. Successful. Whatever word makes sense." I sipped my coffee. It didn't seem to matter to anyone until now. Her eyes dropped to her hands. "That's not fair." I waited. "Maybe not, but it's true." Vanessa fidgeted. "You know, Mom and Dad always talked about you like you were too distant, like you didn't want to be part of the family." I almost laughed. I wasn't distant. I was just never invited to be close. There's a difference. She looked up, eyes rimmed with confusion, maybe guilt. "So this is who you are now? The woman everyone suddenly admires?" "No," I said, voice quiet but certain. "This is who I've always been. You're just seeing it now." She sighed, leaned back, and stared out the window. "You have every right to be angry. I know that. But I guess I never thought you needed anything from us." "I stopped needing things," I replied, "after years of asking for them and never getting them. There's a difference between independence and exile, Vanessa. I chose one because the other was handed to me." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said more than her words could. We left the cafe separately. No hugs, no promises, just space, the kind that could stretch into healing or just drift apart. I was okay with either. That night, I opened an old notebook I hadn't touched in years. It was filled with blueprints, concepts, dreams I had sketched in my 20s. Back then, I used to write ideas with such urgency, afraid they'd vanish if I didn't pin them to paper. Some of the pages made me smile, naive, messy, brilliant. Others made me ache. dreams I'd buried not because they failed, but because no one believed in them except me. But now I had a meeting, not with investors I had to convince, with a man who had already said, "You changed everything." That kind of validation, when it arrives without begging, rewires something inside you. You begin to imagine new futures, not just possible, but deserved. Monday came. I didn't dress for war or for performance. I wore what made me feel capable. I walked into Sinclair Partners without a pitch, without a mask. Edward greeted me with a handshake and something more powerful, eye contact that held weight, not performance. The room was filled with people who weren't dazzled by charm but driven by clarity. They didn't care about last names, wedding photos, or perfect veneers. They cared about impact, and I had it. We talked for hours. Strategy, design, risk, legacy. I didn't shrink. I didn't perform. I simply stood inside the space I had carved for myself. At the end of it, Edward said something I would carry with me for years. You don't just have vision, you have velocity. I nodded, more grateful than I could say, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I belonged. I was simply showing what I already knew. The partnership moved faster than I expected, but not in a way that felt rushed. It felt inevitable. When you're finally seen by the right people, momentum builds naturally. No chasing, no justifying, just unfolding. Within weeks, I was flown out to the San Francisco office of Sinclair Partners. Not for press, not for ceremony, but to sit at the table with people shaping systems, not stories. I didn't stay in a hotel. Edward had arranged for a guest loft beside the strategy wing industrial, clean and quiet, with a view of the bay that stretched like a promise. Most days I worked without pause. My fingers tapped through code like they remembered every late night that had brought me here. I led innovation sessions that didn't start with "can we," but "when do we begin?" I was no longer the woman who had to choose silence to make others comfortable. I was the woman asked to speak first. But even in that rush of creation, a part of me lingered back east in that ballroom, in that family, in that story I had tried so hard to rewrite. One morning, as the fog rolled in over the water, my mother called. The first time since the wedding. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Hi, Mom." She didn't start with small talk. "I didn't expect that speech," she said. "Edward Sinclair?" I let the pause stretch. Neither did I. But it wasn't planned. He just saw me. She exhaled. "I think I owe you an apology. I'm listening." "I don't know if I ever made room for who you are," she said. "Not the version I wanted, but the real one." The words caught me off guard. Not because I'd never wanted them, but because I'd stopped needing them. "Thank you," I said. It was enough. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't magical, but it was honest. And that was new. Vanessa texted me a week later. "Dad asked about your Zurich talk. He's watching it on YouTube." I stared at the screen. He hadn't called. But the gesture mattered. Maybe people don't change all at once. Maybe they shift inch by inch when they're finally forced to see what's been in front of them all along. One evening, I walked out of a board meeting into a hallway where Edward was waiting. He didn't speak right away. Then he asked, "Do you miss them?" I didn't have to ask who. "Sometimes," I replied, "but mostly I miss what I thought they could be." He nodded slowly. "That's the ache that lingers longest, expectations that never materialized." And yet, I said, I'm still here. He smiled. You didn't escape them, Juliet. You outgrew them. That night, I took a walk down to the water, wrapped in a long coat against the bay breeze. The city lights shimmered across the waves. I stood at the edge, remembering the girl who used to write code under blankets, who skipped dances for invention, who watched her family cheer for someone else and thought maybe she was too much or not enough. And I whispered out loud to no one in particular, you were never too much, and you were always enough. Then I turned back toward the building, toward the team, toward the next problem to solve. I wasn't waiting for a spotlight anymore. I was building my own light, one idea, one decision, one unapologetic choice at a time. Months passed. The world didn't stop for my evolution, but I noticed it started to move differently around me. Invitations began to come in not from my family, but from conferences, think tanks, publications. Suddenly, Juliet Vaughn wasn't just a name mentioned in passing, but one spoken with intention. People started listening, not because I shouted louder, but because I no longer lowered my voice. There was a quiet power in not needing to explain any more. I returned to New York for a keynote, this time not tucked in a back row, but framed on the cover of the event brochure. My face, my work, my terms. The hotel lobby was buzzing when I arrived. Staff rushing with lanyards and media kits. I checked in under a name they now recognized. The receptionist offered a nervous smile. It's an honor to have you, Ms. Vaughn. I nodded politely. I had learned how to accept respect without shrinking. That evening, before the keynote, I stood alone backstage. No stylist, no entourage, just me. I wore the same black lines I wore to the wedding. Clean, structured, me. As I stepped onto the stage, the lights weren't blinding anymore. I saw rows of people, not just professionals, but dreamers, the kind I used to be. I spoke for 40 minutes, but the words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place deeper than planning. I told the truth about being overlooked, about building in silence, about becoming someone I once thought only existed in other stories. When I stepped down, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, real. Afterward, as I mingled with attendees, I noticed a familiar figure waiting near the exit. My sister, Vanessa. Her hair was shorter, her dress simpler, her face softer. She held her purse with both hands like a shield. "Hi," she said when I approached. "You came?" I replied. "I wasn't sure you would." She shrugged. "I wasn't sure either." A pause. Then she added, "I watched your Zurich talk twice." I smiled. "Did you understand it?" "Not entirely," she admitted, "but I felt it." She looked down. "I used to think you were just cold, but you weren't. You were just always looking for a language we didn't know how to speak." I nodded. "And you were always waiting for me to become a version you recognized." She exhaled. "Do you think we could try again? Not as who we were, but as who we are now?" That question didn't fix the past. It didn't erase years of silence, but it opened a door, and that was enough. We walked to the hotel cafe and talked, really talked, about things that mattered, about the quiet parts, about what it meant to rebuild not just companies, but relationships. Later that week, my father sent me an email. One line. "I'm reading about machine learning. It's hard, but I want to understand." I stared at it for a long time, then wrote back, "Start with curiosity. Everything else follows." When I returned to San Francisco, Edward called me into his office. He handed me a folder. "We're starting a new branch," he said. "Your vision, your lead. I want you to decide what it becomes." I took the folder with both hands. It was heavy, not with paper, with trust. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said. "You've already proven the most important skill of leadership." "What's that?" "Knowing who you are, even when others don't." I left his office and stood in the hallway for a long time, not to collect my thoughts, but to honor them. For the first time, I felt no rush to prove, no need to be seen. I had nothing to earn, only something to build. My own space, my own voice, my own definition of success. That weekend, I visited a bookstore by the pier, the kind that smelled of old pages and ambition. I wandered to the nonfiction aisle and pulled out a book on leadership. As I flipped through, a quote caught my eye. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up exactly as you are." I closed the book and smiled. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. I was already living it. And as I stepped out into the California sun, wind lifting strands of my hair, I realized the truest applause is internal. It's when your life echoes back to you not the approval of others, but the sound of your own steps, steady, unshaken, and entirely your own.